All right, so we are done with cognitive errors, and we now move on to the second category of behavioral biases, which is emotional biases. There are 6 emotional biases that we are going to study, and you can try and remember these 6 biases using the acronym LOSSER. So LOSSER. This L is for loss aversion, whereby people might prefer avoiding losses over achieving gains. Then we have O for overconfidence, which is an unwarranted faith in one's abilities. The first S is for self-control, where we might fail to act in pursuit of long-term goals. So this actually is a lack of self-control. Then we have a status quo bias, where we might do nothing rather than make a change, even though making a change is what should be done. Then E for endowment. People value assets more when they hold rights to it. And R is for regret aversion, whereby people want to avoid the pain of regret, which would be associated with bad decisions. Over the next few slides, we'll talk about each of these in more detail, but it would be useful if over here you just try and remember the names of these 6 biases, and the acronym LOSSER will help. So again, loss aversion, overconfidence, self-control, status quo, endowment, regret aversion. The first emotional bias that we'll talk about now is loss aversion. Loss aversion is a bias in which people prefer avoiding losses over achieving gains. When comparing absolute values, the utility derived from gains is much lower than the utility which is given up with an equivalent loss. So in other words, people feel more hurt when there is a loss, and they feel less happy when there is a comparable gain. Let's understand this point through a value function. So we have a graph over here. Let's say this is our reference point. The x-axis represents gains and losses. So over here we have gains, and on the left we have losses, and the vertical axis represents value. So let's say we want to estimate the value or utility associated with gains and losses. Say there is a 5% gain, and for this 5% gain, obviously there is happiness or utility, and let's say that that utility is a certain number of units. So let's say that that is 10 units over here. So we have this point. But if there is a 5% loss, so we are at minus 5% here, the unhappiness or the giving up of utility will be much more. So let's say that that's going to be 15. So this is minus 15 over here. So we have a curve that looks like this. For a given gain, there is happiness, but when we have the same amount of loss, the unhappiness is more. And when we actually graph this out, we have something that looks like this. And this highlights the fact that the happiness associated with gains is lower than the unhappiness associated with losses. And this goes back to the original point that people feel more unhappy. So the unhappiness associated with losses is more than the happiness associated with gains. Now let's look at the consequences of loss aversion. One consequence is that people with this particular bias will hold on to investments that are in a negative or in a loss position for longer than justified. And the implication is that portfolios become more risky than is justified. So let me just illustrate what this means. Say a person bought a stock for 20 and now the stock has come down to 15. There is a chance that a person will hold on to the stock even though, let's say 15 is a good price to sell the stock, but there has been a loss, and if the stock is sold, then the loss will be realized. but people don't want to actually realize the loss, so they are likely to just hold on to this particular stock. Even though a price of 15 was a reasonable stock to sell. And now, because of behavior like this, people will hold on to riskier portfolios for longer than is justified. Related to this is a situation where people might sell investments in a gain position earlier than justified. So, for example, if a stock was at 20 and then it went up to 22, and now there is a fear that the stock will go down. Because of this fear, a person might just sell over here, even though the fundamentals might indicate that the stock will go further up. And because of this, people might trade excessively and they will sell winners. So they just want to realize the gain so that they don't have to deal with a potential loss. Between these two things that I've described, this sort of behavior is called the disposition effect. So this disposition effect is the holding of investments that have experienced losses too long and the selling of investments that have experienced gains too quickly. So selling this sort of investment that has experienced a gain, selling this too quickly, and holding on to investments that are giving a loss for too long. And again, the reason for that is people don't want to realize the loss. And collectively, this disposition effect results in people having portfolios or holding on to portfolios that are more risky than they need to be. The larger point is that because of this loss aversion bias, we limit the upside potential of a portfolio. And again, we are selling winners too quickly and holding on to losers for too long. How do we overcome the loss aversion bias? The way this bias can be overcome is by using a disciplined approach to investment based on fundamental analysis. Our next bias is the overconfidence bias. People with this bias demonstrate unwarranted faith in their own intuitive reasoning, the judgments that they make, and or cognitive abilities. So the point is that people are just overconfident in their knowledge or in their analytical skills. Under overconfidence bias, we have two subcategories: the illusion of knowledge bias and then self-attribution bias. Let's talk about the illusion of knowledge bias. So the illusion of bias at a high level means that people have an illusion that they have more knowledge than they actually do. And this can lead to prediction overconfidence. So if an investor is predicting future cash flows or future stock prices, they might predict a range that's very narrow because they have very high confidence in their knowledge and their ability to predict. So they come up with a very narrow range, whereas in reality, the range should be much more than what they have come up with. So this is prediction overconfidence. They have high confidence in their ability to predict. Then we have certainty overconfidence. Here, the probabilities are too high. So for example, if an investor is bullish on a given stock and does his or her analysis, they might have a tendency to give a very high probability to an up move. So if the stock is currently at 50 and they are very confident the stock will go up, they might say that there's a 90% chance that the stock will go up, even though there might be so many variables because of which the stock might go down. So this 90% might be too high a probability for the stock going up. So these are the two flavors under illusion of knowledge. Then we have self-attribution bias. Again, this is a category or falls under overconfidence bias. Here, investors take credit for success and assign responsibility for failures. And we see this around us all the time. When things go well, people attribute it to their own ability, their own knowledge, their own analysis skills. But when things don't go right, they might blame bad luck or blame someone else. So more formally, when we say self-enhancing bias, This describes the propensity that people have to claim too much credit for their own success. So when things go well, people claim that it's because of what they did. This is self-enhancing. And then the other is self-protecting. When things don't go well, people blame bad luck or other people for their failure. And in a sense, what they're doing is trying to protect themselves. And that's called self-protecting bias. So moving on to the consequences. One consequence is that we might underestimate risks and overestimate expected returns. The other consequence is that we might hold on to poorly diversified portfolios. So this is something that keeps coming up. It is the consequence of many of the biases that we've talked about. How can we overcome the bias? One strategy is to review trading records, identify winners and losers. When you look at data, the stocks that you bought, how they performed, and if it was in line with your expectations. So you look at that. Keeping track of your performance history and performance record can help you overcome this confidence bias. So if you look back and see that you keep assigning a very high probability for a stock to go up, for example, but in the past the stock hasn't gone up that often, you can then make adjustments to your probabilities. The next is to calculate your portfolio performance over 2+ years. So again, this will allow you to look at what you predicted versus what actually happened. Try to make an effort not to confuse brains with a bull market. So you might think that your investments are doing really well because you picked them, but the reality might be that the whole market is performing well and your stocks are performing well like all other stocks. So this is basically because of the bull market, not because of how smart you are or how much knowledge you have. And then conduct post-investment analysis, which is related to the earlier points. When you do a post-investment analysis, you can look at whether your predictions actually turned out to be correct or not. And if you have this overconfidence bias, you will notice that often your predictions end up not being correct. And then after that, you can adjust your predictions in the future. Next, we have the self-control bias. Here, people fail to act in their long-term best interest because of lack of self-discipline or lack of self-control. So this should really be called the lack of self-control bias, but that would become too long. So this bias is simply called the self-control bias. We all know that people are impulsive. People like to do things quickly. People like to respond to their feelings. And because of that, there is an inner conflict between short-term satisfaction and the achievement of long-term goals. If people are giving in to their impulses and short-term satisfaction rather than pursuing long-term goals, then they are exhibiting self-control bias. A classic example for people who are pursuing the CFA charter is that rather than studying and achieving the long-term goal of getting their charter, people might get distracted by short-term things and impulsive actions, and because of that, they might not study enough. So that would be an example of self-control bias. What are the consequences? One consequence is that people might not save enough for the future. So obviously, it makes sense to save for retirement, but an impulsive action might be to buy a new car or to buy some gadget that's not really needed. And this would imply that people don't have enough funds for the future. If this happens and retirement is looming, then people might invest in assets that have very high returns, but these high returns come at high risk. And investors, therefore, who suffer from this bias might end up having to accept much more risk than is reasonable for them. Another possible consequence is that people might borrow excessively to finance current consumption. So current consumption can be impulsive, and to finance some impulsive desires, people might end up borrowing much more than they should. How do we overcome the bias? One strategy is to create a good plan and then basically stick to that plan. So rather than responding to impulses, we work with an expert to come up with a good plan and then stay on that plan. Moving on to the status quo bias. In this bias, people have a tendency to do nothing rather than making a change. So basically, people like to maintain the status quo. The major reason for this is that we tend to be lazy, and because of this laziness, we just keep things the way they are. We do not necessarily look for opportunities where a change is beneficial. And a common phrase which illustrates this phenomenon is the following: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So essentially, what happens with the status quo bias is that people maintain positions due to inertia rather than conscious choice. So if investment decisions are made and somebody has certain investments, they are likely to just stay on with those investments because of inertia, not because they are consciously thinking that it makes sense to continue with a set of investments. So let's more formally look at the consequences. One consequence is to unknowingly maintain portfolios with risk characteristics that are inappropriate. So what does this mean? Let's say that when we are relatively young, we have a portfolio that is somewhat risky, and this risky portfolio makes sense given our current circumstances. But as we get older, theoretically, our portfolio should become less risky. However, due to the status quo bias, we might just maintain this risky portfolio, and it essentially then has risk characteristics that are inappropriate given our current circumstances. Another consequence here is that we fail to explore other opportunities. So we just stick with what we have, stick with our positions, and don't consciously try to look for other opportunities that make more sense. How do we overcome this bias? One obvious strategy is education. So both in terms of recognizing that this bias exists and also education in terms of recognizing how the risk profile needs to change with time and how different risk profiles will then correspond to different investment choices. Also, we should quantify risk reducing and risk enhancing advantages of diversification and proper asset allocation. So as our situations change, we need to understand what our appropriate risk profile should be, and then we should take the necessary actions. Moving on to the endowment bias. With this bias, people value an asset more when they hold rights to it relative to when they do not have rights to an asset. So let's take a simple example. Say I've been living in a given house for many years. So in a sense, I have ownership of this house. I've been living in it. I'm emotionally connected to this house. So that's what it means when we say that we hold rights to this asset or an asset. And for some reason, I want to buy a very similar house that's next door. Say I want to buy this for a close family member, and this house is for X dollars. But I think that this house is not worth X dollars. X dollars is too high a price. But for some reason, if I were required to sell my house, I would ask for a price more than X. Now, clearly, this is irrational. It violates the law of one price because these two houses are similar. When I am thinking about buying another house, I think X is too much. But when I want to sell this house, which I have lived in for many years, I ask for a price that is more than X. Why does this happen? This happens because I am emotionally attached to this asset, and because of that emotional attachment, I am asking for a higher price. Now, the emotional bias can combine with the status quo bias. Remember, with status quo bias, we say that when we already own assets or we have some investments, we tend to just stick with them. We don't want to do the analysis. We don't want to think about what to do with the assets. So we just stick to them. Now, how does that link with the endowment bias? With the endowment bias, we also have a tendency to just stay on or stick to assets that we've owned from before or that we hold rights to. So the implication of both is to just hold on to our assets. And this is the reason why clients might be reluctant to sell assets which have been bequeathed by an earlier generation. So, for example, if a client received some assets from his parents who got it from grandparents, these assets have been in the family for a long time. There is, in a sense, an endowment, or the client has rights on this, has an emotional attachment to these assets. And because of this emotional attachment, the client might just hang on, even though it might not be the rational thing to do. So what are the consequences? We've already addressed some of these consequences. One consequence is to fail to sell certain assets and replace with other assets. So this is assets where there is an emotional attachment. And then because of this, we might maintain an inappropriate asset allocation. So the assets that we've just held on to because of an emotional attachment, these might not make sense for us because of our current risk profile or because of our current circumstances. And we might also continue to hold on to familiar assets. So we might have a link with assets that we've had for many years. Those assets are familiar to us. Because of that familiarity, we get attached to these assets and just hold on to them, even though it might not make logical sense. How do we overcome the endowment bias? When dealing with inherited assets, we should ask the question, if I were given an equivalent amount in cash, how would I invest? So if I would invest in that same asset, then obviously it makes sense to stay on with that asset. But if that same amount of cash would be invested somewhere else, then I should obviously think about selling that asset. So what I've said several times is this bias exists because of an emotional attachment. So we should try and address that emotional attachment. The final kind of emotional bias that we'll talk about is the regret aversion bias. In this bias, people tend to avoid making decisions out of fear that the decision will turn out poorly. So we avoid making decisions that are risky or decisions where we might be criticized later. And we basically don't want people to tell us, why did you do X, Y, Z? Under regret aversion, there can be an error of commission or an error of omission. An error of commission is where we just take a safe action. So many years ago, for technology managers, there was a phrase that you can't go wrong if you buy from IBM. That's because IBM was the biggest computer manufacturer, the biggest provider of IT equipment. So purchasing from IBM was just the default thing to do. If you purchased from IBM and let's say for some reason the decision later turned out not to be very good, you could still present a defense that I just took the safe action. I went with IBM because everybody else was also purchasing from IBM. So that would be an error of commission where a decision was made, but it was simply what appeared to be the safest decision. Error of omission is where we avoid making a risky decision. So in a given situation, it might make sense to take a certain amount of risk, but if we avoid that risk because we are afraid that things will turn out poorly in the future, then that's an error of omission. So what are the consequences? Because of this bias, we might be too conservative with investment choices. And with certain investment choices, the outcomes might have been poor in the past, and that's made us extra risk averse. We have been criticized in the past for not making good decisions, so we just avoid making decisions. We just possibly stick with what we have. The other consequence is engaging in herding behavior. So if everybody is doing something, whether that's right or wrong, we just follow what everybody else is doing. This way, if the decision turns out to be wrong, we can be comfortable that it was wrong, not just for us, but for everybody else also. How do we overcome this bias? One is education. So recognizing that this bias does occur. We should quantify risk reducing and return enhancing advantages of diversification and proper asset allocation. And we should recognize that losses happen to everyone. So we should not be too afraid of losses. Okay, so we are done with our 6 emotional biases. Just a quick recap. To remember these 6 biases, I asked you to learn the acronym LOSSER. So LOSSER. The first L is for loss aversion. And here we said people prefer avoiding losses over achieving gains. Then we talked about the overconfidence bias, where people have an unwarranted faith in their own knowledge or abilities. Self-control bias was actually a lack of self-control. We tend to be impulsive. With status quo bias, we basically stick to our current situation. We don't want to make changes. We are lazy. And then endowment bias, people value assets more when they hold rights to it. And regret aversion is where people avoid the pain of regret associated with bad decisions. Now, there appears to be a relationship between status quo and these next 2, endowment and regret aversion. In all 3 cases, the tendency is to stick with whatever we have or to make basically safer decisions. But there is a subtle difference. With status quo, we are not making a decision because of inertia. It's not really a conscious choice. Whereas with endowment and regret aversion, we are making a conscious choice, but that conscious choice is probably not very rational. So the outcome might be the same, but the reasoning is different. Effectively, with status quo, there is no reasoning. But with endowment and regret aversion, there is reasoning, but the reasoning is flawed. So those are the 6 emotional biases that you need to be on top of.